So today's lesson is about how to create a succinct and meaningful lesson plan. Here's a little bit of vocabulary to consider when thinking about lesson planning. The number one blunder is students have unclear targets when they're beginning a lesson. So we as teachers want to make sure that our learning goals are clear. So first we want to begin with language. Use student-friendly and straightforward language in the learning goal. Second of all, simplicity. What is just one objective? Try not to make it too complicated. You're not trying to impress anyone. You're just trying to convey what the goal of the lesson is going to be. Is it manageable? Can you really achieve this learning goal within 40 minutes? And lastly, your audience for the learning goal or target should be the student. The learning targets and goals can be divided into 4 different categories. Students can be asked to learn knowledge by the end of a lesson. Avoid using language like students will be able to understand the Bill of Rights. What does that mean? Make it more crystal clear, such as students will be able to list 3 reasons why the Bill of Rights were written, or students will be able to identify 5 of the first 10 amendments. Second of all, skills. What skills will students practice and apply? You want to be very specific. You also might have dispositions, such as students will collaboratively argue or debate. A disposition is different than a skill or knowledge. It's often more challenging to evaluate, and it requires really helping students to understand what collaboration or active listening might mean. You might need to define the disposition, and you might need to provide students with examples of what it looks like. And lastly, a learning target or an objective could result in a product. What will the students create by the end of the lesson? Often we evaluate our students the last way that we as college students might have been evaluated. Those evaluation forms might be classroom discussions, multiple choice, and homework. Relying on classroom discussions as an assessment tool is not effective because we rarely ever have 100% of our students participating in a discussion. Actually, we find that the data shows as few as 5 students will often account for 75 to 95% of a discussion. Multiple choice has its place, and with technology, it's much easier to get a quick snapshot of what students know. However, know that relying too much on multiple choice will not provide teachers an opportunity to understand why students might have a misunderstanding. So multiple choice tells us that the students got the right answer or did not get the right answer, or perhaps that they guessed, but we do not know their thinking process behind it. Homework is not an amazing way to evaluate if students understood our lesson. If you want to evaluate if students understood your lesson, the evaluation should occur before they leave the classroom. An authentic assessment is something that students might do in real life as opposed to a multiple choice test or a quick quiz. An authentic assessment gives students something that those do not, which is time to think and process. It also provides you, the teacher, with a tangible, concrete document so that you can review, again, not just if students grasped the concept or didn't grasp the concept, but why by looking at their process. Students can often demonstrate their knowledge by creating things. These are an example of 90 activities that Vermet has listed. These are different ways that students can apply knowledge while also applying skills. These are different ways that students can become engaged. It's also important that we use formative assessments. We do not want to wait until the summative assessment at the end of the class or the end of the week until knowing whether or not students understand what we're teaching them. Many teachers might say, "Do you understand?" In the history of schooling, very few students will raise their hand and say, "No, I do not understand." So it's important for us to use sophisticated formative assessment tools to be able to get a sense of whether or not students understand without putting the onus on them to ask us to stop or tell us they don't understand. We can evaluate students' understanding through active engagement, where the students the more students are doing, the less we are passively transmitting knowledge to them. And while the students are doing the work, we can walk around, we can listen, and we can observe. That's probably one of the best ways to formatively evaluate if students understand the objective. Wiggins and McTighe have 6 ways that we can formatively assess knowledge by having students do the following. First of all is having students explain through an explanation. They explain a concept by making a brochure, a postcard, or a bumper sticker. They are explaining, and through their explanation, you can get a sense of whether or not they understand the concept. The second way to formatively assess knowledge is through interpretation. You can ask students to interpret a text and write their own notes and summary of that text. So it's not just that they're filling in a multiple choice test, but they are interpreting a text and writing their analysis of it. The third way we can formatively assess knowledge is by having students apply knowledge to a simulation. So we can ask students to apply the information as if they are one of the actors from history or one of the characters from a book or one of the composers or artists. The fourth way we can formatively evaluate students is through perspective. If we divide students into different groups and have them analyze information from different perspectives, they're then able to better understand how complicated knowledge is and how much perspectives might dictate or alter the way we view knowledge. The fifth way is empathy. Students will reflect in a journal on their thoughts and feelings on an issue. And lastly, self-knowledge. Students evaluate their progress and their growth in growing their own skills, dispositions, and knowledge base. These 6 ways to formatively assess knowledge have been tested by Wiggins and McTighe and found to be an effective way to not only engage students, but also to formatively evaluate if students are understanding the learning goal. You might have a great assessment and a great objective, but the two could mismatch. One of the biggest blunders found by the researchers is when students have a great target and a great assessment, but they don't line up to one another. You want to make sure that your assessment is actually evaluating the objective. Sometimes teacher candidates have a really fun activity, but it doesn't really relate to the goal. Sometimes the lesson might be overly project focused, and students are so focused on a project, they lose sight of why they're doing something. So again, you want to make sure that there's structure and explanation and students are understanding why they're doing the project and how it's helping them achieve the goal. Sometimes a lesson is the opposite. It's focused on one minute fact, and that dominates the entire lesson. You want to make sure that you have a just right scope and it's not too narrow and it's not too general. And lastly, sometimes there's loose threads. A connection between the assessment and the objective are there, but it's not articulated by the teacher. It's not clear. Backwards planning is another construct created by Wiggins and McTighe. We want to begin when lesson planning by identifying our desired result. That's why the assessment is actually on the top of the lesson plan, because that's what we're trying to help students to be able to do. What will students do by the end of the lesson? That's the whole point of creating a lesson plan. The more time the students are spending doing the assessment, the better. Then we want to plan the content and the skills that you're going to teach around the final product and assessment. The next blunder that many novice teachers have is how to begin a lesson. You want to make sure that when you begin a lesson, you're motivating the students, you're hooking them. That's why I have this illustration of someone fishing. You're grabbing the student's attention and you're connecting to their background knowledge. Do's and don'ts of beginning a lesson. So I'm going to begin with the don'ts. Do not start with a lecture. Do not start by reading a passage. Do not have something too complicated, long, and do not require students to have specific facts memorized. And do not be too teacher-driven. So now the do's. So how do we begin an effective lesson? Do start with a problem or a story to get students curious and interested. You could have a quick review. You could have questions. You could begin by showing an image or a cartoon to get students interested in the topic. And recently, more and more scholars are considering giving students time to explore or discover in the beginning of the lesson. And instead of having it just a quick 4-minute, engage having longer time for students to discover a problem and try to work on it collaboratively and then doing the teaching at the end. So you can almost flip the class where the students are doing most of the doing in the beginning, and then towards the end of the class, you help facilitate and articulate how the students should be doing it or give them some tips. The more student driven and student centered, the better. A big question to ask yourself is, am I trying to transmit knowledge or am I trying to have students engage with knowledge? So just because we might have experienced high school education that looked very much like a lecture in a traditional setting of banking doesn't mean we have to be those kinds of teachers. So you want to ask yourself, how much of the learning is passive, where the students are not being held accountable or asked to do much of the doing, versus active learning? Again, how we were taught doesn't have to dictate how we teach. In the videos that you're watching for your virtual hours, you can really think about how many of these teachers are engaging students actively. It is important for students to process information, but memorization often only works in the short term. And in the long term, it doesn't build any enduring understanding of content area. This brings us to your lesson plan. This is your last assignment in the class, 20%. I'm going to highlight some of the areas of the lesson plan. You want to make sure the standard, the learning objective, and the assessment all align. They have similar language. It might sound a little redundant, but you want to make sure that you are evaluating the target, the learning objective, and that aligns to the standard. Begin by thinking about, what will the students do by the end of the lesson? How will you evaluate them in what they're doing, both formatively and summatively? Let's try to shift away from class discussion as a formative assessment. As we know, it's not 100% participatory. The process steps are the first column of your lesson plan. Now, depending on if you're teaching a science lesson, you might have the 5 E's: engage, explore, evaluate. If you're teaching a reading lesson, you might have gradual release process, where you begin by modeling something and then the students do it together in guided practice, and then they independently do it on their own, or you might have group work. So we try not to worry too much about the names of the process steps. You could just have beginning, middle, and end. I would always begin with a student-driven engage or some kind of anticipatory set where the students are engaging in the topic area. The teacher on the student side, make sure the teacher isn't doing all the work. So you really do want to, for good classroom management, know where the students should be sitting, what tools they should have out, what are they doing? If you are lecturing for 5 minutes, what are the students doing? If you don't give them specific directions, they will not pay attention. Are they taking notes? Are they filling in a graphic organizer? Are they on their Chromebooks? Are they adding their ideas to Jamboard? So the better teachers always consider what the students are doing every moment of the day. Students can do anything, but they cannot do nothing. So if you do not tell them explicitly what they should be doing, then they might be on their phones or daydreaming or doodling in their notebooks. So you want to be very specific about what the students should be doing at each moment of the lesson plan. Finally, differentiated instruction. So we went over this in module 3, where I asked you to consider your 3 groups of students, your novices, proficient, and master students in those categories. So what resources, materials, content, products, and process will you differentiate for different students in the room? You want to provide very specific tools and strategies to help students. And if you need a reminder, go back to module 3 and you can watch the video that gives different ideas on how to differentiate.